Palestine is a state. That's according to the UN. But the tide appears to be turning nonetheless. A growing number of countries in the West have said they could soon recognize a Palestinian state as Israel becomes increasingly more isolated over its war on Gaza. But there were strings attached. 15 countries issued a joint declaration during a UN conference this week led by France and Saudi Arabia to push for a two-state solution. Canada and the UK could soon join the likes of Spain and Ireland, who have already endorsed a Palestinian state. They're expected to make their position official at the UN General Assembly in September. Even Germany, which has been staunchly pro-Israel, seems to be shifting its tone, with the foreign minister saying that negotiating a two-state solution must begin now. Small question, though. How could you resolve a dispute between two states if you don't recognize one of them? Unsurprisingly, the US still seems to be the exception. On Thursday, it sanctioned Palestinian Authority and PLO officials, partly for their role in pursuing legal cases against Israel, most notably in the International Court of Justice, which is looking at accusations of genocide against Israel. But what does it actually mean in practice to, quote, recognize Palestinian statehood? The move is viewed as largely symbolic, but in practice, it could be the catalyst to end decades of continued Israeli occupation and illegal settlement expansion, and to fulfill the rights of Palestinians to self-determination. This is Beyond the Headlines, and I'm your host, Nada Al-Tahir. In this bonus episode, we look at the legal obligations that come with the recognition of Palestine, and we ask, why does it even matter while Israel continues to destroy and starve Gaza?
I can confirm the UK will recognise the State of Palestine by the United Nations General Assembly in September, unless the Israeli government takes substantive steps to end the appalling situation in Gaza, agree to a ceasefire, and commit to a long-term sustainable peace, reviving the prospect of a two-state solution.
That's the British Prime Minister Keir Starmer. But even in his declaration to recognize Palestine, there is a word that stands out. Unless. It sounds more like a condition. But actually, Palestinian statehood is not a reward, punishment, or bargaining chip, but rather a right enshrined to Palestinians by law. And UN member states, the UK included, are obliged to uphold that law. But it's worth asking, what exactly is the significance that these statements coming from all these Western countries at the conference pledging their support for Palestine? I posed this question to Ardim Sis, ICJ lawyer and professor of law at Queen's University in Canada.
The first place to begin, frankly, is with the obvious, and that's with the ongoing genocide of the Palestinian people. The genocide, of course, comes as part of a larger whole, historical process of Zionist settler colonialism in occupied Palestine, running about 140 years, frankly, where the Zionist movement has failed in its history at any moment in time to physically remove the Palestinian people from the land. They have been compelled to use ever more oppressive and violent means to secure their end. Their ultimate end, of course, is to take the land, but that also means that the Zionist movement will not rest. And they've been open about it. The next thing now is, what is the high-level conference about? The goal, ostensibly, of this conference is to gather a consensus of states around an action-oriented drive to ensure peace, but through what is called accountability, and especially as outlined in the International Court of Justice's advisory opinion of 2024, July 19, 2024, which determined that Israel's physical presence in the occupied Palestinian territory is in and of itself an internationally wrongful act, an illegality, an aggression, which must end as rapidly as possible. Israel has to end the occupation by 18 September 2025. That's only a few months away from now. That's not going to be easy, clearly. Many of these states have different views on how far they're willing to push the Israelis on it. But the point about the high-level conference is to ensure that the prospect of the Palestinian people's right to exercise freedom and independence in their own state is kept alive through reference not to political postulates, but to clear, cogent international legal obligations of Israel as determined by the International Court of Justice this last summer.
How successful do you think these efforts are going to be, especially when some of the same countries that are extending their support now have been actually really reluctant to cut diplomatic ties with Israel or take tangible measures on the ground that would prevent the killing of the very Palestinians that this conference attempts to protect.
There are very few options available to the Palestinian people and to the international community who are supportive, the overwhelming majority of the international community that is in fact supportive of the Palestinian people in principle, to save that people from obliteration in the face of only a few states, the United States, Israel, and a handful of other Western states, the United Kingdom, Canada, France, Germany in particular. But what I can say, without a doubt, is that we're in a stage right now where all hands have to be on deck. It's a proverbial point, of course, but we don't have the luxury to say, well, that process is not worth it or that action is not available. No, every single multilateral action available to the Palestinian people to protect its continued existence as a people, juridically, physically, economically, culturally, must be used and utilized by every person on planet Earth who is of good faith and goodwill aimed at the freedom of these people.
What role does the Palestinian leadership play in all of this?
In the first instance, the state of Palestine, which does exist and has a leadership, has the obligation and has undertaken various actions on the multilateral plane within the UN system, the General Assembly, the International Court of Justice, the International Criminal Court. They're all acting and they're pressing hard in those realms. The same state of Palestine is under foreign military occupation of a genocidal occupying power that will stop at nothing and has been very clear at ensuring that state is not a free state, is not able to continue developing, growing, and exercising its freedom on behalf of its people and so on. And so it's a tough position for the state of Palestine to be in. Does that mean that the leadership of the state of Palestine, such as it is, does not have an obligation? Of course it doesn't. And from what I see on the international plane, they are taking that obligation seriously. But does that mean that only the state of Palestine is responsible to end all of this? Absolutely not. I underscore this point. Since November 1947, the United Nations as an organization has held what we call a permanent responsibility for the question of Palestine until it is resolved in all of its aspects in accordance with international law. Because it was the United Nations that chose to partition Palestine through Resolution 181 of 29 November 1947, violating expressly the right of self-determination of the indigenous Palestinian population of Palestine, who was then the vast majority of the population of the country and who told the General Assembly through the Arab states who were representative on this General Assembly that they did not want their country to be partitioned, period. Then a Western-dominated General Assembly in 1947 chose, notwithstanding the desires of the indigenous Palestinian population, to recommend partition. And it was after that, 3 days after that recommendation, that a civil war broke out in Palestine, the first 6 months of which resulted in the ethnic cleansing of 300,000 Palestinians. And then on the declaration statehood of the new Jewish state of Israel, and this new state of Israel resulted in a further 450,000 Palestinian refugees. And the Nakba was created effectively. And it's because of the United Nations' direct responsibility role played in the Nakba of 1948 that they hold, the United Nations, this permanent responsibility for the question of Palestine until it is resolved in all of its aspects. So the responsibility for the Palestine question as such is to be borne not only by Palestine in trying to deal on the sharp end with the ravages against it, not only by Israel as the actor, the main protagonist who is destroying or attempting to destroy the Palestinian people and their future in the land incessantly, but also by the international community, including third states.
Everybody talks about a two-state solution, but it seems that Israel had been systematically blocking every effort that would actually bring us closer to a two-state solution. How realistic is a two-state solution? Is it just something that we're chasing after without knowing whether it's going to happen?
Let's be clear. If one looks at the UN record on the eve of the partition resolution in 1947, one would think that this is absurd. But since the establishment of the State of Israel and its acceptance by the United Nations into the organization, It has consolidated itself as a state, in fact, with an economy, a military, territory, etc. And over time, the international community, most particularly in the region, the Arab states, have had to come to terms with that as a reality. This has inevitably led to certain decisions made by the Arab states, including by the representatives of the Palestinian people through the Palestine Liberation Organization, to acknowledge the existence of this settler colonial state. They did so on the assumption, and this goes to your point, that if they acknowledged the existence of this state, there would be a quid pro quo, that this state would leave the occupied Palestinian territory, allow the Palestinian people to establish a self-determination unit, a state of their own in only 22% of the historical patrimony of Palestine. And yet, the settler colonial state has not done that. So your question is a fair question. Why should we be talking about the two-state solution in 2025 when the occupying power has made it clear that they've no intention at all of allowing the Palestinian people to exercise self-determination in the occupied Palestinian territory? And the only answer I can offer you, and I'm not now suggesting to you that this answer is a perfect one, in the long term, by which I mean generations, 100 years or more, it is, in my view, inevitable that there will be one state between the river and the sea for all of its citizens, regardless of their faith, one person, one vote, as most democracies should operate. But none of that can happen without the agreement of those who live in the land. And it is clear from the Zionists who control the land that they've no desire to grant Palestinian rights from the river to the sea at all. So we must shift our focus on who within the international community can be relied upon to give some reprieve or help the Palestinian people obtain a modicum, not complete, but at least a modicum of justice. But that can't happen until you have the establishment of a free Palestinian state in at least the occupied Palestinian territory. And if we were now to suggest that no, we must give up on the prospect of the establishment of a free Palestinian state in the occupied Palestinian territory because it isn't being respected, or the occupying power has become genocidal, or is indeed genocidal from its beginning and is now acting upon it. If we give up on that for this vision of a one state, it would be folly. It would be folly, politically speaking. So in my view, you don't get to a one state until such time as the international community allows and helps establish Palestinian state that is free and sovereign in the occupied Palestinian territory. And over time, the people between the river and the sea will decide what kind of arrangement they want to live in the future.
Why does the recognition of a Palestinian state even matter so much?
People who are looking at this situation, it might seem rather ludicrous that there should be a Palestinian state, or that even recognition of it politically would matter in the face of a genocide that is happening. So let me be clear that the most important thing that needs to happen today is to end the genocide immediately. The ceasefire won't do it. The Israelis are very clear what they're going to do. They're going to starve the population. They will continue to bombard the population. They will corral that population in Al Mawasi and in the southwest of the Strip to the point where they hope the population leaves or dies. But looking at it more broadly, the reason why recognition matters is because we know what is animating the genocide. The desire of the Zionist state of Israel to do away with the Palestinian people politically as a national entity, as a people with a right to self-determination in their native land. And so what is of vital importance is that third states, who are the only hope to get Israel to change its ways through pressure, third states send Israel the message that we will not recognize your sovereignty or your claims to sovereignty in occupied Palestine any more than we would recognize your claims to sovereignty in our own territories. You are not sovereign in foreign territory. The occupied Palestinian territory is foreign to you, regardless of what your claims are. And therefore, we will demonstrate this by recognizing the state of Palestine as a state and entering into diplomatic relations with that state, with all the legal consequences that flow from such relations. So for instance, on free trade, right? I'll take my country as an example. And it has a free trade agreement with Israel. And in that agreement, it defines Israel as including the occupied Palestinian territory, which is a violation of Canada's international legal obligations. Canada has an obligation to recognize and help fulfill the Palestinian people's right to self-determination. So if it does recognize Palestine as a state, it will then be compelled to change its bilateral relations with Israel, economically, politically, diplomatically, and so on. That's why recognition matters.
This is the first time I've heard someone actually put their finger on why recognition matters, and that it's not just a form of moral support, but a step that actually carries real weight when it comes to how countries deal with Israel.
If I might just carry the point on just a bit, that does not mean that once recognition of these holdout states in the West is secured, that the job is done. Politics never stops. Freedom never stops. What that does mean is that once you have the recognition, then you're on a better, solid ground. Recognition is not required under international law. It isn't a requirement of states. It's a political prerogative of them to recognize each other. But once recognition happens, legal consequences flow from that. Legal obligations flow from that. The most important of those obligations is the duty to respect the territorial integrity and political independence of the entity recognized. And that touches on trade relations, cultural relations, economic relations, military relations of third states with Israel, who claim sovereignty illegally in occupied Palestine.
That's it for Beyond the Headlines. This episode was produced by Ben Barqawi and audio engineered by Arthur Edison. Du'a Farid is our editor, and I'm your host, Nada Al-Tahir. One more thing before you go, we do want to hear from you, so help us improve our podcast by taking a 2-minute listener survey. You can find the link in the episode's show notes. Thank you so much for listening.